Hello, A-Push people. So, we have entered World War II. We've declared war on Japan. Countries have declared war on us. So, we are at war. Today, we are gonna talk about the home front during the war. And when we say home front, we mean what's going on in the United States while we are off at war. So, let's first talk about mobilization. The federal government had a big role in this mobilization effort. As in World War I, the U.S. government organized a number of special agencies to mobilize U.S. economic and military resources for the wartime crisis. Early in 1942, the War Production Board, WPB, was established to manage war industries. Later, the Office of War Mobilization, OWM, set production priorities and controlled raw materials. The government used a cost-plus system in which it paid war contractors the cost of production plus a certain percentage of profit. One federal agency, the Office of Price Administration, OPA, regulated almost every aspect of civilians' lives by freezing prices, wages, rents, and rationing such commodities as meat, sugar, gasoline, and auto tires, primarily to fight wartime inflation. Deficit spending during the Depression was dwarfed by the deficits incurred during the war. Federal spending increased 1,000% between 1939 and 1945. As a result, the gross national product grew by 15% or more a year. World War II proved what the New Deal did not, that the government could spend its way out of a depression. By war's end, the national debt had reached the then staggering figure of $250 billion, 5 times what it had been in 1941. So as the war went on, as the war progressed through the times, the deficit spending increased for our national economy, equaling the gross national product to go up. Not grow up, go up. Business and industry, stimulated by wartime demand and government contractors, U.S. industries did a booming business far exceeding their production and profits of the 1920s. The Depression was over, vanquished at last by the coming of war. By 1944, unemployment had practically disappeared. So, a myth out there is the New Deal ended the Depression. That's a myth. Of course, the New Deal did good works to save unemployment, but what really ended the Depression was this mobilization effort by the federal government before we entered World War II and when we were at World War II, because unemployment went down, because companies were hiring, and booming business because the government and the demand was high on certain supplies. So the supply and demand worked a whole lot to end the Depression. War-related industrial output in the United States was astonishing. By 1944, it was twice that of all the Axis powers combined. Instead, the automobiles, tanks, and fighter planes rolled off the assembly lines. American factories produced 300,000 planes, 100,000 tanks, and ships with a total capacity of 53 million tons. So efficient were production methods that Henry Kaiser's giant shipyard in California could turn out a new ship in just 14 days. The war concentrated production in the largest corporations as smaller businesses lost out on government contracts to larger businesses with more capacity. The 100 largest corporations accounted for up to 70% of wartime manufacturing. So, the manufacturing during the wartime, especially with bigger corporations that can turn out lots of these planes, tanks, ships, did good business. Their business was booming during World War II. Let's shift topics to research and development. Governments work closely not only with industries but also universities and research labs to create and improve technologies that could be used to defeat the enemy. The Office of Research and Development was established to contract scientists and universities to help in the development of electronics such as radar and sonar, medicine such as penicillin, jet engines, rockets, and in the top secret Manhattan Project, the atomic bomb. Ironically, many of the European scientists that had to flee fascist persecution would contribute to its defeat working in the United States. We'll get to the atomic bomb, especially in the next chapter or further along in this chapter. Yeah, we'll get to the atomic bomb later on in the next video. So, workers and unions, labor unions and large corporations agreed to that while the war lasted, there would be no strikes. Workers became disgruntled, however, as their wages were frozen while corporations made large profits. John L. Lewis therefore called a few strikes of the coal unions. The Smith-Connolly Anti-Strike Act of 1943 passed over Roosevelt's veto, empowered the government to take over war-related businesses whose operations were threatened by a strike. In 1944, Roosevelt had occasion to use this law when he ordered the army to operate the nation's railroads for a brief period. So government got directly involved in this wartime production, especially to the companies that were producing wartime goods. This was a complete 180 turn from laissez-faire type government. Financing the war. We know there's a huge deficit at the end in 1945. The government paid for its huge increase in spending, $100 billion spent on the war in 1945 alone, by 1. Increasing the income tax, and 2. Selling war bonds. For the first time, most Americans were required to pay an income tax, and in 1944, the practice was begun by automatically deducing a withhold tax from checks, borrowing money by selling $135 billion in war bonds supplemented the tax income. Supplemented the tax increase. In addition, the shortage of consumer goods made it easier for Americans to save. So what you need to know here is the two ways of financing the war for the United States was increasing the income tax and selling war bonds, which increased production and borrowing money. Wartime propaganda. Few people opposed the war, so the government's propaganda campaign of posters, songs, and news bulletins was primarily to maintain public morale, to encourage people to conserve resources, and to increase war production. The Office of War Information controlled news about troop movements and battles. Movies, radio, and popular music all supported this notion of a cheerful, patriotic view of the war. For example, Norman Rockwell's popular illusion of four freedoms captured the liberties and values at stake in the war. The unity of Americans behind the war's democratic ideals helped a generation remember it as the Good War. So this war was about defeating the ideas of fascism and communism, and this was reflected in the propaganda released by the Office of War Information to create this sense of a good war. So, and then we are going to take another shift to the second part of today's lecture, the war's impact of society. Because this war had an impact on all different spectrums of societies. So let's start with the African Americans. So, attracted by jobs in the North and West, over 1.5 million African Americans left the South. In addition, 1 million young men left home to serve in the armed forces. Whether as soldiers or civilians, all face continued discrimination and segregation. White resentment in urban areas led to dozens dying in race riots in New York and Detroit during the summer of 1943. Civil rights leaders encouraged African Americans to adopt a double D slogan, one for victory over fascism abroad, and one for equality at home, because they were fighting two separate battles, African Americans, because on the home front, they suffered racial discrimination and segregation. Membership in the NAACP increased during the war. Another civil rights organization, the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE, was formed in 1942 to work more militantly for African Americans' interest. After black leaders threatened a protest march on Washington, the Roosevelt administration issued an executive order to prohibit discrimination in government and in businesses that received federal contracts. One judicial victory was achieved in the Supreme Court case of Smith versus Allwright, 1944, which ruled that it was unconstitutional to deny membership in political parties to African Americans as a way of excluding them from voting in primaries. So, a Voting Rights Act in 1944 in the Supreme Court case of Smith versus Allwright. So, African Americans did have some challenges during the war effort. Let's shift our focus to Mexican Americans. Many Mexican Americans worked as in defense industries, and over 300,000 served in the military. A 1942 agreement with Mexico allowed Mexican farm workers, known as brareros, to enter the United States in the harvest season without going through formal immigration procedures. The sudden influx of Mexican immigrants into Los Angeles stirred white resentment and led to the so-called Zoot Suit riots in the summer of 1943, in which whites and Mexican Americans battled on the streets. So race riots in Los Angeles not only included African Americans, but they also included Mexican Americans. So next, we are going to talk about the American Indians. American Indians also contributed to the war effort. Approximately 25,000 served in the military, and thousands more worked in defense industries. Having discovered the opportunities off their reservation, more than half never returned to their reservation. When we talk about World War II's impact on society, this group gets mentioned a lot, and you'll see why if you don't know already from previous history classes you have taken. Japanese Americans. More than any other ethnic group, Japanese Americans suffered from their association with a wartime enemy because we declared war on Japan. Almost 20,000 native-born Japanese Americans served loyally in the military. Nevertheless, following the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japanese Americans were suspected of being potential spies and saboteurs, and the Japanese invasion of the West Coast was considered imminent by many. In 1942, these irrational fears, as well as racism, prompted the U.S. government to order over 100,000 Japanese Americans on the West Coast to leave their homes and reside in the barracks of internment camps. Japanese Americans living in other parts of the U.S., including Hawaii, did not come under this order. In the case of Kurozma versus U.S., the Supreme Court upheld the U.S. government's internment policy as justified in wartime. Years later, in 1988, the federal government agreed the ruling was unjust and awarded financial compensation to those still alive who had been interned. So it took them until 1988 for the U.S. government to realize this whole incident was horribly wrong and apologized. This event sometimes gets overlooked in the grand scheme of American history, but this did happen on U.S. soil. And some people may argue that this was dark, this was almost considered slavery, but it happened. Was one of the darkest days in American history, but it happened. Women. The war also changed the lives of women. Over 200,000 women served in uniform in the Army, Navy, and Marines, but in non-combat roles. As in World War I, an acute labor shortage caused women to take jobs vacated by men in uniform. Almost 5 million women enlisted in the workforce. So this was a spike in jobs for women, just like we saw during World War I, because all the men were fighting the war, so the women had to stay home and do the jobs that men usually do if they weren't at war. So this again spiked a labor shortage, which in all made women join the workforce more than ever. Wartime solidarity. The New Deal helped immigrant groups feel more included and serving together as bands of brothers in combat or working together for a common cause. In defense plans help to reduce prejudice based on nationality, ethnicity, and religion. The wartime migration also helped to soften racial differences and open the eyes of many Americans to the injustice of racial discrimination. But it still happened during the time period, but this author argued it was less predominant as if we weren't at a war during this time. The election of 1944. This is the last part of this lecture, and then we'll end. With the war consuming most of people's attention, the presidential election in 1944 had less interest than usual. Again, FDR. Many felt that in a war emergency there should be no change in leadership. Again, prompting the same conclusion back in the election of 1940. The president therefore sought and received a Democratic nomination for the fourth time. There was a change, however, in the Democratic nomination in the Democrats' choice of a vice presidential running mate. Party leaders felt that Roosevelt's third-time Vice President Henry Wallace was too radical and unmanageable. With Roosevelt's agreement, they replaced Wallace with Harry S. Truman, a Missouri senator with a national reputation for having conducted a much publicized investigation of war spending. Although Roosevelt publicly denied medical problems, those near him recognized his uncertain health. Thomas Dewey. The Republicans nominated the 42-year-old governor of New York, Thomas Dewey, who had a strong record of prosecuting corruption and racketeering. The Republican candidate was unable to offer any real alternatives to Roosevelt's leadership and genuine enthusiasm for change. So this character that the Republicans put up to go against FDR was offered little change and offered no alternatives to Roosevelt. So results: winning 53% of the popular vote and overwhelmingly 432 to 99 in the Electoral College. That's a landslide if you haven't heard of one yet. That's a true landslide right there. The president was elected to an unprecedented fourth term. No president in the history of the U.S. has been elected 4 terms. So, as it proved, however, FDR would live for less than 3 months after his inauguration because of health concerns. Most of his term would be served by Truman. Alrighty, guys. So next lecture, we are going to talk about the battlefronts in World War II and the decision of the U.S. to use the atomic bomb.